Welcome back. We are now moving on to the final project for the marking period and the school year. In this project, you will apply skills associated with memoir writing, skills which were the subject of our analysis for Units 7 and 8. Take a moment to read the prompt and determine how we will be applying use of skills we were analyzing in Tan and Alexi's novels, considering what this prompt requires. You may respond to this question in the class comments for your weekly participation. The first thing you might have noticed is that we have been analyzing memoirs throughout Units 7 and 8, and this culminating final project requires us to write a memoir. Beyond that, there were certain aspects of memoirs that we were analyzing, and those components we were analyzing were specific to memoirs and are not typically prevalent in texts that would be considered autobiographical. As a reminder, take a look at these two excerpts and determine how memoirs have specifically different elements from autobiographies. These are the elements that we will have to include in our own memoirs. Again, you may respond to this question in the class comments for your weekly participation. You might have identified these differences, and you may have also made the connection that the author's unique use of voice in the excerpt on the right-hand side allowed for this more intimate account of the life event being described. We have actually analyzed how authors' uses of voice allows for this effect when we analyze the different ways in which Tan and Alexi wrote The Joy Luck Club and The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, respectively. Many students, for instance, pointed out that Alexi's use of humor in The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian allowed for insight to be gained into Junior's feelings about the hardships he endured. Specifically, his use of humor revealed that he felt he still had things to be grateful for, despite his many physical ailments, and this might very well have been his purpose for writing, to relay that message. This is another thing you will want to consider before writing your memoir. In fact, you should establish your purpose for writing in order to develop your voice. Different uses of voice, after all, can be used to fulfill different purposes. Even Amy Tan, who initially intended for her novel to be a compilation of fictional short stories, had an intended purpose in the back of her mind, as she indicates in this interview.
And I started adding more stories, and I wanted more stories because I wanted the variety of writing a story with different conflicts. And then at the end, I had this mess of 16 stories. My editor looked at them and she said, they're about mothers and daughters. And it was the first time that I realized it. I thought I was writing a story that was at first just stories, the craft of fiction. And then it became a story about my mother and me. And so
One can thus conclude that Tan's relationship with her mother had many different layers, and each bit of nuance with respect to her relationship with her mother was revealed through the different characters' conflicts. The complexity of her relationship with her mother is paralleled by her use of multiple first-person narration, which is one aspect of her voice. So, these are things you want to consider when establishing your voice. Do you want to be humorous? Do you want to be serious? Do you want to be sarcastic? How will such uses of voice help you to fulfill your purpose? Considering your purpose, how would first-person or multiple first-person narration be more appropriate? Also important to note is that even though a memoir is a narrative about one's self, you do not necessarily have to be relegated to first-person narrative points of view. Some students had asked if they could write from a third-person perspective, and I had responded by saying that it depends on what the purpose of writing is. So before I provide an example, why do you suppose an author would choose to write a memoir which is about oneself from a third-person perspective? Again, you may document your thoughts as responses in the class comments for your weekly participation. If you are still at a loss for ideas, watch this interview with the late and great Rowdy Roddy Piper, a former WWE wrestler. In this interview, he discusses his career in wrestling, and, at the end of the interview, he refers to himself in the third person. consider why he does this. Moreover, considering why he refers to himself in the third person, if he had written a memoir, identify what his purpose would have been.
Wrestling it has a tremendous entrance plan. You come in as, boy, here you are, you rock and roll and everything is wonderful. It's got no exit plan. What would you have me do at 49 when, like, my pension plan I can't take out till I'm 65? I'm not going to make 65. Let's just face facts, guys.
And while Piper has returned to a game that says it has cleaned up its act, the fast times that claim Spicoli and so many others remain etched in the minds of those who, to some degree, have survived life in pro wrestling.
I hate it. I don't watch myself on TV. I hate that guy. Because I know what that guy's thinking. I know what that guy's capable of doing. I know what he's thought of. And there's nothing nice about that guy at all.
That guy being you.
That guy being Roddy Piper.
You might have guessed that he refers to himself in the third person because he regrets past decisions he made, and in hindsight, he feels disconnected from his former self. As such, he might hypothetically have chosen to write a memoir using a third-person narrative as an element of his voice to inform the reader of how much he has changed since his youth, essentially having become a different person. So now pretend for a moment that I am Rowdy Roddy Piper, and I want to create a memoir for the aforementioned purpose. It might look something like this. As you are watching this bit from the hypothetical memoir I have created, you may record any other observations about my use of voice and how it might fulfill my purpose for writing in the class comments. So without any further ado, here is my sample of the Memoir Project. Rowdy Roddy Piper. Hot Rod, they called him. He was full of charisma. He was a box office draw. He's running toward the apron. Scores of people are chanting his name. He soaks it up. He's drunk off the fame. He felt like he was on top of the world. He had no idea how hard reality would hit him. Obviously, I would go on to describe the specific conflicts that involved reality figuratively hitting me, but the purpose of this was for you to get a sense of how I applied an appropriate use of voice and how the project could be executed. So, my use of voice was appropriate because I would have wanted to inform the audience of how disconnected I felt from my former self, and I emphasize this through my use of third-person narration. I'm effectively talking about myself as though I am not myself, so I'm placing emphasis on the fact that I feel disconnected from the person I used to be. Notice how short and choppy my sentences were. Why might I have done that? Perhaps I wanted the structure of my sentences to parallel how short and brief that feeling of elation from all the fame and notoriety was. I also used some figurative language, most of which invoke feelings of disorientation. He's drunk off the fame. How hard reality would hit him. Why might these phrases have been appropriate? Perhaps I wanted to emphasize how twisted my perception of the fame was, and the sudden shock I felt when I realized the fame was not as great as I had originally imagined it would be. These are all things you want to consider, so that you meet all of the criteria on the rubric. I will now leave you with this question. How does my sample of a segment of a hypothetical memoir meet the criteria of this rubric? And how can you do similar things to meet those criteria? Please answer this question to provoke a discussion in the class comments. Respond to your peers as well, so we can all build off of each other's ideas. Also, please note, if you do not feel comfortable writing about yourself, you may do as I had just done and pretend you are someone famous writing a memoir. I look forward to you sharing your ideas in the class comments.